The silence before violence is always the loudest sound in the room. Sarah Mitchell had learned this truth the hard way, standing in a military training facility surrounded by 314 of the strongest soldiers in the country. What they were about to witness would shatter everything they thought they knew about strength, courage, and the power that lies dormant within the human spirit when pushed beyond every limit. In that split second, when Marcus Thompson's fist cut through the air toward her face, time seemed to freeze. The watching soldiers held their breath. The instructors leaned forward. And Sarah, barely 5 feet 4 inches and weighing less than most of the men's backpacks, made a choice that would echo through military training programs for decades to come. Some moments define us. Others destroy us. This was the moment that would do both. The crack of bone breaking wasn't the most shocking sound that day. It was the collective gasp of 314 hardened warriors realizing they had just witnessed something that would change their understanding of what it truly means to fight back. Sarah Mitchell never planned to become the woman who could break a man's arm with her bare hands. Growing up in the small town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, she was the girl who rescued injured birds and cried when her goldfish died. Her mother, Linda, worked double shifts at the local diner, while her father remained a ghost in their lives, present only in the form of monthly child support checks that arrived sporadically. The transformation began when Sarah turned 16. Walking home from her part-time job at the grocery store, she took her usual shortcut through Maple Park. The evening air was crisp with autumn, and street lamps cast long shadows across the empty playground. She was thinking about the algebra homework waiting for her at home when she heard the footsteps behind her. At first, she thought nothing of it. Cedar Falls was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and kids played in the streets until dark. Crime was something that happened in big cities, not in their quiet corner of Iowa. But the footsteps matched her pace exactly, speeding up when she did, slowing when she tried to listen. When she turned around, she saw him. Danny Martinez from her high school, 3 years older and twice her size. His reputation preceded him through the hallways like a dark cloud. Stories of his temper, his encounters with the law, the way smaller kids crossed the street when they saw him coming. "Hey, Sarah," he called out, his voice carrying that particular tone that made her skin crawl. "Where you going in such a hurry?" She tried to keep walking, but he grabbed her wrist. His fingers wrapped around her arm like a vice, and she could smell alcohol on his breath. The next few minutes became a blur of panic and desperate struggle. She screamed, but the park was empty. She fought, but he was so much stronger. It was Mrs. Henderson's dog that saved her that night. The old German shepherd came barreling across the park, barking and snarling at Danny until he let go and ran. Sarah collapsed on the grass, shaking and sobbing, while the dog sat beside her like a faithful guardian until Mrs. Henderson found them 20 minutes later. The police were called, but nothing came of it. Danny claimed he was just trying to be friendly. No witnesses except an old woman and her dog. "Boys will be boys," the officer suggested with a shrug that made Sarah want to scream all over again. That night, lying in her bed with the covers pulled up to her chin, Sarah made a promise to herself. She would never be helpless again. She would never again feel the terror of being overpowered by someone who saw her as nothing more than an easy target. The next morning, she walked into Miller's Martial Arts Academy on Main Street. The owner, Jack Miller, was a former Marine who had opened the studio after returning from his 3rd tour in Afghanistan. He was cleaning equipment when the bell above his door chimed, and he looked up to see a small teenage girl with determined eyes and bruises on her wrist. "I want to learn to fight," Sarah told him without preamble. Jack studied her for a long moment. He had seen this before, kids who came to him after something bad had happened, looking for a quick fix to make them feel safe again. Most of them quit after a few weeks when they realized that real martial arts training was more about discipline and patience than about becoming a superhero overnight. But there was something different about Sarah Mitchell. Something in the way she stood, the set of her shoulders, the unwavering directness of her gaze. She wasn't looking for a hobby or a way to impress her friends. She was looking for survival. "It's not going to be easy," he warned her. Real training takes years. It's going to hurt, and you're going to want to quit more times than you can count. I don't care, Sarah replied. I need to be strong. Jack nodded slowly. Then we start tomorrow. 6 a.m. sharp. Don't be late. Sarah wasn't late. She wasn't late the next day either, or the day after that. While her classmates slept in on Saturday mornings, she was in the studio practicing forms, her body aching from the previous day's training. While they went to parties on weekend nights, she was studying videos of technique, memorizing the subtle movements that could mean the difference between winning and losing a fight. The first year was the hardest. Her body wasn't used to the constant physical demands. She came home each day with new bruises, sore muscles, and occasionally split lips from sparring sessions. Her mother worried that she was pushing herself too hard, but Sarah couldn't explain the driving need inside her to keep going. Jack was a tough instructor, but fair. He taught her that strength wasn't just about muscle. It was about leverage, timing, and, most importantly, the mental fortitude to keep fighting when everything in your body told you to give up. He taught her to read her opponents, to see the telltale signs that preceded an attack, to turn an attacker's strength against them. Size doesn't matter, he told her during one particularly grueling training session. What matters is knowing exactly where and how to strike. A smaller person who knows what they're doing can take down someone twice their size if they're smart about it. Sarah absorbed every lesson like a sponge. She learned the vulnerable points on the human body, the places where even a light touch could cause devastating pain or temporary paralysis. She practiced until the movements became second nature, until she could execute them without thinking, relying purely on muscle memory and instinct. By her senior year of high school, Sarah had earned her black belt and was helping Jack teach the younger students. She had grown into her training, her once soft body now lean and powerful. But more than the physical changes, there was something different in her eyes, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. The old Sarah would have looked at the ground when she walked down the hallways. The new Sarah looked everyone in the eye and walked with purpose. When Danny Martinez tried to corner her again during her junior year, thinking perhaps she had forgotten their encounter in the park, she handled the situation very differently. "Touch me again," she told him quietly, "and you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Something in her voice made him step back. He never bothered her again. College brought new challenges and opportunities. Sarah chose to attend Iowa State University, partly because of their excellent criminal justice program, but mostly because it was close enough that she could continue training with Jack during breaks. She declared a major in criminal justice with a minor in psychology, driven by a desire to understand both the legal system that had failed her and the minds of people who preyed on others. Her professors were impressed by her dedication and her unique perspective on personal safety and self-defense. She began giving presentations to women's groups on campus, teaching basic defensive techniques and sharing her story. Word spread, and soon she was invited to speak at high schools and community centers throughout the state. During her sophomore year, Sarah caught the attention of a military recruiter who attended one of her presentations. Captain Elena Rodriguez was a tough woman with 20 years of service under her belt, and she saw something special in the young college student who could command a room full of people twice her age. "Have you ever considered military service?" she asked Sarah after the presentation. Sarah had never seriously thought about it. The military seemed like a world apart from her small-town Iowa upbringing. But Captain Rodriguez painted a picture of opportunities for advanced training, the chance to protect others on a larger scale, and, most importantly, access to some of the best defensive and combat training in the world. "The Army has programs specifically designed for people with your skills and background," the captain explained. "Military police, special forces support, training instruction. You can make a real difference." The idea intrigued Sarah. She had always felt a calling to help others, to be the person for someone else that she wished had been there for her that night in the park. The military could provide the training and opportunities to do that on a scale she had never imagined. But first, she had to finish college. Sarah threw herself into her studies with the same intensity she had brought to martial arts training. She maintained a 4.0 GPA while continuing to teach self-defense classes and train with Jack every chance she got. She also began studying additional martial arts disciplines, adding boxing, kickboxing, and even some weapons training to her repertoire. Jack noticed a change in her focus during her junior year. She was training harder than ever, pushing herself beyond what even he thought was necessary for a college student planning to graduate and get a normal job. "What's driving you, kid?" he asked her one evening after a particularly intense training session. Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead and looked at her reflection in the studio mirror. The girl staring back at her was unrecognizable from the frightened teenager who had walked through the door 4 years earlier. "I want to be ready," she said simply. "Ready for what?" "For whatever comes next." What came next was a phone call from Captain Rodriguez during Sarah's senior year. The Army was launching a new training program designed to prepare soldiers for close-quarters combat situations, particularly in urban environments where traditional military tactics weren't always effective. They needed instructors who could bridge the gap between military training and civilian self-defense techniques. "We've been following your work," Captain Rodriguez told her. "Your reputation has reached some important people. If you're still interested in serving, we have a position that might be perfect for you." Sarah graduated from Iowa State with highest honors and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army 3 weeks later. Her mother cried at the ceremony, proud and terrified in equal measure. Jack was there too, standing at attention even though he was no longer on active duty, wearing the medals from his own service with quiet pride. The Army's advanced training program was unlike anything Sarah had experienced, even with her years of martial arts background. She learned weapons handling, tactical planning, and military protocol. But most importantly, she learned how to train others, how to take the skills she had developed, and pass them on to soldiers who might one day need them to save their own lives or the lives of their fellow service members. After completing officer candidate school and her specialized training, Sarah was assigned to Fort Braxton, a large military installation in North Carolina that served as a training hub for various specialized units. Her job was to develop and implement hand-to-hand combat training programs for soldiers preparing for deployment to areas where close-quarters fighting was a realistic possibility. The work was challenging and rewarding. Sarah found that she had a natural talent for instruction, able to break down complex techniques into simple, repeatable movements that soldiers could master quickly. Her classes became some of the most popular on the base, known for being both highly effective and intensely demanding. But it was the request that came down from headquarters during her second year at Fort Braxton that would change everything. The Army was planning a large-scale demonstration of their new training techniques for military leaders from around the world. They wanted to showcase how modern hand-to-hand combat training could prepare soldiers for the realities of contemporary warfare. Sarah was chosen to lead the demonstration. She would be working with 314 soldiers from various units, showing them and their commanding officers the effectiveness of the new training protocols. It was an honor that recognized her growing reputation within the military training community. What nobody knew, including Sarah herself, was that among those 314 soldiers was Sergeant Marcus Thompson, a man whose own demons would soon collide with Sarah's hard-won strength in a moment that neither of them saw coming. Marcus Thompson had always solved his problems with his fists. At 6 feet 2 inches and weighing 230 pounds, most of his problems stayed solved. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of Detroit, he learned early that strength was the only currency that mattered on the streets. His father, when he was around, taught him that real men didn't back down from anyone or anything. His mother, overwhelmed by 3 jobs and 2 other children, simply wasn't around enough to teach him anything else. The Army had seemed like a natural fit for someone with Marcus's background and temperament. He enlisted at 18, fresh out of high school with mediocre grades, but impressive scores on physical fitness tests. The military promised structure, purpose, and a legal outlet for the aggression that had gotten him into trouble as a civilian. For the most part, it worked. Marcus excelled in basic training and quickly earned promotions through the enlisted ranks. He was the kind of soldier that drill sergeants loved, strong, obedient, and willing to push through any physical challenge. His fellow soldiers respected his strength and generally stayed out of his way when his temper flared. But respect built on fear is a fragile foundation, and cracks had been showing in Marcus's facade for months before that fateful day at Fort Braxton. It started with the divorce papers that arrived in the mail 3 weeks before the training demonstration. His wife, Jessica, had finally had enough of his anger, his drinking, and his refusal to seek help for what she delicately referred to as his adjustment issues. The papers shouldn't have surprised him. Jessica had been threatening to leave for 2 years, ever since the night he put his fist through their kitchen wall during an argument about money. She had started sleeping in the guest room, stopped talking to him except when absolutely necessary, and flinched whenever he raised his voice. But seeing it in black and white, the legal dissolution of the only stable relationship he had ever known hit Marcus harder than he expected. Jessica was taking their house, half of his military pension, and, worst of all, their 7-year-old daughter, Emma. The custody arrangement allowed him 1 weekend per month and 2 weeks during the summer, supervised visits only until he completed anger management counseling. Marcus read the papers 3 times before crumpling them up and throwing them across his barracks room. Then he went to the base bar and drank until the military police had to escort him back to his quarters. It wouldn't be the last time that month. The second blow came when he was passed over for promotion to staff sergeant. Marcus had been expecting the promotion for months, had even started shopping for the new chevrons he would wear on his uniform. His performance reviews were solid, his physical fitness scores were among the highest in his unit, and he had the experience and knowledge necessary for the increased responsibilities. But his commanding officer, Captain Williams, called him into his office and delivered the news with the kind of clinical detachment that military officers perfected when delivering bad news to subordinates. "Your technical qualifications are excellent, Sergeant Thompson," Captain Williams said, not looking up from the files spread across his desk. "But there are concerns about your leadership potential, specifically your interpersonal skills and anger management." Marcus felt his jaw clench. "Sir, with respect, my performance speaks for itself. I've never failed to complete a mission, or being a good soldier and being a good leader are 2 different things," Captain Williams interrupted. "Leadership requires emotional intelligence, the ability to work with people who might not always do what you want them to do. Your fellow soldiers respect your strength, but they don't trust your judgment when you're angry. And, according to multiple reports, you're angry more often than not these days." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but Marcus stopped listening after Captain Williams mentioned mandatory counseling sessions and reevaluation in 6 months. He left the office feeling humiliated and furious, convinced that his career was being derailed by soft officers who had never seen real combat, who didn't understand that sometimes strength was the only thing that kept people alive. The third and final blow came 2 days before the training demonstration. Marcus received a phone call from his ex-wife informing him that his scheduled visit with Emma was being canceled because their daughter was afraid to be alone with him. Apparently, Emma had overheard a conversation between Jessica and her lawyer about Marcus's drinking and his history of violent outbursts. "She's 7 years old, Marcus," Jessica said, her voice tight with exhaustion and disappointment. "She doesn't understand why Daddy gets so angry all the time. She's been having nightmares." Marcus wanted to protest, to explain that he had never hurt Emma, that he would never hurt Emma, that everything he did was to protect his family and provide for them. But the words died in his throat because somewhere deep inside, he knew Jessica was right. He remembered the fear in his daughter's eyes when he had shouted at Jessica during one of their final arguments. He remembered how Emma had started hiding in her room whenever his voice got raised. That night, alone in his barracks room with a bottle of whiskey that he wasn't supposed to have on base, Marcus Thompson stared at himself in the small mirror above his desk and saw a stranger. The man looking back at him was angry, bitter, and completely out of control. His marriage was over, his career was stalling, and his own daughter was afraid of him. But instead of recognizing these feelings as symptoms of deeper problems that required help and healing, Marcus channeled them into the only emotion he knew how to handle: rage. Someone was going to pay for his humiliation. Someone was going to feel what it was like to be powerless and afraid. The morning of the training demonstration dawned clear and cold at Fort Braxton. The large training facility had been configured specifically for the event, with 314 soldiers arranged in formation around a central demonstration area. Military leaders from 7 different countries sat in elevated viewing areas, notebooks in hand, ready to observe and evaluate the effectiveness of the Army's new hand-to-hand combat training protocols. Sarah Mitchell arrived at the facility 2 hours before the demonstration was scheduled to begin. She had been preparing for this day for months, designing scenarios that would showcase not just individual techniques, but the overall philosophy behind the new training approach. The idea was to demonstrate that effective close-quarters combat wasn't about size or raw strength. It was about technique, timing, and the mental discipline to remain calm under pressure. As she walked through the facility, making final preparations, Sarah felt a familiar mix of nervous excitement and complete confidence. This was what she had trained for, what all those years of martial arts practice and military instruction had been building toward. She was ready to prove that the skills she had developed could be taught to others, could make a real difference in preparing soldiers for the challenges they might face in the field. The soldiers began filing into the facility at 0800 hours. Sarah watched them from her position near the demonstration area, noting the mix of experience levels and backgrounds represented in the group. Some were young recruits fresh out of basic training, while others were seasoned veterans with multiple deployments under their belts. All of them would be participating in different aspects of the demonstration throughout the day. Marcus Thompson was among the last to enter the facility. Sarah noticed him immediately, partly because of his imposing physical presence, but mostly because of the barely contained anger that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a furnace. She had seen that look before, on the faces of students who came to Jack's studio looking for a way to hurt people rather than defend themselves. As the ranking officer for the demonstration, Sarah had reviewed the files of all participating soldiers. She knew that Marcus was going through a difficult divorce, that he had been passed over for promotion, and that his commanding officers had concerns about his temperament. Under normal circumstances, she might have recommended that he be excluded from the demonstration. But the decision hadn't been hers to make, and now he was here, carrying his pain and anger like weapons looking for a target. The first part of the demonstration went exactly as planned. Sarah worked with volunteers from the audience to show basic defensive techniques, emphasizing how proper body mechanics and leverage could allow smaller defenders to neutralize larger attackers. The visiting military leaders took notes and asked thoughtful questions. The participating soldiers seemed engaged and attentive, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was building toward an explosion. She caught Marcus staring at her several times during the presentation, his expression unreadable but intense. When she called for volunteers to participate in more advanced demonstrations, his hand was the first to shoot up. "I'll volunteer," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the facility. Sarah hesitated for a moment. Every instinct told her that putting Marcus Thompson in the demonstration ring was a bad idea. But refusing his volunteer participation in front of 314 soldiers and visiting military leaders would require an explanation she wasn't prepared to give. "Very good, Sergeant Thompson," she replied. "Please step forward." As Marcus walked toward the center of the demonstration area, Sarah noticed that the energy in the room shifted subtly. Conversations died down. Soldiers leaned forward in their seats. Even the visiting military leaders seemed to sense that they were about to witness something significant. Sarah began explaining the next technique to the audience, but she was acutely aware of Marcus standing just a few feet away from her. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and she could see the tension in his shoulders and neck. Whatever was happening inside his head, it had nothing to do with the training demonstration they were supposed to be conducting. The key to effective defensive techniques, Sarah was saying to the audience, is to remain calm under pressure and to use your opponent's aggression against them. When someone attacks with anger and emotion, they often create opportunities for a trained defender to "that's easy to say when you're not really fighting." Marcus interrupted, his voice loud enough that everyone in the facility could hear him clearly. Sarah paused, surprised by the interruption, but not yet alarmed. Soldiers sometimes challenged instructors during training. It was part of the learning process. "You're absolutely right, Sergeant," she replied evenly. "Real combat situations are different from training scenarios. That's why we practice these techniques until they become second nature, so that we can execute them effectively even under extreme stress." Marcus took a step closer to her, and now Sarah could smell the alcohol on his breath. He had been drinking probably since the night before, and the combination of alcohol and whatever emotional turmoil he was experiencing was creating a dangerous cocktail. "You want to talk about real combat?" Marcus's voice was getting louder, more aggressive. "You want to show these soldiers what real fighting looks like?" The facility had gone completely silent. 314 soldiers and their commanding officers were watching an interaction that was clearly spiraling beyond the bounds of a normal training demonstration. Sarah could feel the weight of their attention, could sense that everyone in the room understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could try to de-escalate the situation with words, but Marcus was clearly beyond the point where rational conversation was going to help. She could call for security, but that would end her career and probably his as well, and it would turn what was supposed to be a showcase of American military training into an embarrassing spectacle. Or she could handle it herself. "Sergeant Thompson," she said quietly, but her voice carried clearly in the silent facility. "I think you should return to your position with the other soldiers." Instead of backing down, Marcus moved even closer. Now they were standing less than 3 feet apart, and Sarah could see the rage burning in his eyes. This wasn't about the training demonstration anymore. This was about his divorce, his failed promotion, his daughter's fear, and every other disappointment and humiliation that had brought him to this moment. "You think you're tough," he said, his voice a low growl that only she could hear. "You think you can teach soldiers how to fight? You don't know what real fighting is." Sarah felt a familiar calm settling over her. The same focused clarity that had carried her through thousands of hours of training with Jack Miller. Her body relaxed into a ready position without conscious thought, muscles loose, and prepared to move in any direction. Her breathing slowed and deepened. Time seemed to stretch, each second extending into minutes. She had trained for this moment her entire adult life, though she had never imagined it would happen in front of an audience of hundreds of people who would remember and judge her response for years to come. Everything she had learned, every technique she had practiced, every lesson about staying calm under pressure was about to be tested in the most public and consequential way possible. "Sergeant Thompson," she said one final time, her voice steady and professional. "Stand down." Instead of standing down, Marcus Thompson drew back his right fist and swung at her face with all the strength and rage he had been carrying for months. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about his military career or the consequences of assaulting a superior officer. He wasn't thinking about the hundreds of witnesses or the visiting military leaders or the end of everything he had worked for over the past decade. He was thinking about his ex-wife and his lost daughter and his stalled career and every person who had ever made him feel small and powerless. And he was thinking that finally, he was going to make someone pay. Time moved differently in the seconds that followed Marcus Thompson's decision to throw that punch. For Sarah Mitchell, years of training compressed into a single moment of perfect clarity. For the 314 soldiers watching, it was as if they were witnessing something that defied the laws of physics. For the visiting military leaders, It was a demonstration beyond anything they had come to observe. Sarah saw the punch coming before Marcus had even fully committed to throwing it. His weight shifted to his back foot, his shoulder telegraphed the movement, and his eyes gave away his intention a full second before his fist began to move. It was a clumsy, emotion-driven attack, exactly the kind of mistake that Jack Miller had taught her to watch for and exploit. As Marcus's fist cut through the air toward her face, Sarah's body responded with the fluid precision of a machine that had been programmed through thousands of hours of repetition. She stepped slightly to her left, letting his punch pass harmlessly by her right ear. The movement was so subtle that many of the watching soldiers didn't even realize she had moved at all. But what happened next was impossible to miss. As Marcus's momentum carried him forward, overextended and off balance from his missed punch, Sarah's right hand shot up and caught his extended arm just above the wrist. Her left hand simultaneously struck his elbow from underneath, hyperextending the joint in a direction it was never meant to bend. The technique was called an arm bar, and when executed properly by someone who knew what they were doing, it was devastatingly effective. The sound that followed was unlike anything most of the soldiers had ever heard. It wasn't just the crack of bone breaking, it was the wet, grinding snap of ligaments tearing, cartilage separating, and an entire joint structure failing catastrophically. Marcus's ulna bone snapped cleanly in two, while his elbow joint dislocated with enough force that his forearm bent at an angle that made several soldiers in the front row gasp audibly. Marcus's scream of pain and shock echoed through the training facility like a siren. He dropped to his knees, clutching his ruined arm against his chest, his face gone white with agony and disbelief. Blood began to seep through his uniform sleeve, where the broken bone had torn through muscle tissue. The entire facility erupted into chaos. Soldiers jumped to their feet, shouting and pointing. Several of the newer recruits looked like they might be sick. The visiting military leaders leaned forward in their seats, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Multiple people began reaching for their phones to call for medical assistance. Through it all, Sarah Mitchell remained perfectly calm. She stood over Marcus's writhing form with the same composed expression she had worn throughout the entire demonstration. Her breathing was steady, her posture relaxed, and there wasn't even a trace of sweat on her forehead. She looked like someone who had just completed a routine training exercise, not someone who had just shattered a man's arm in front of hundreds of witnesses. "Medical team to the training facility," she said in her radio, her voice clear and professional. "We have a soldier down with a compound fracture and possible joint dislocation. Immediate attention required." The medical response was swift and professional. Within 3 minutes, a team of Army medics arrived with a stretcher and emergency medical supplies. They worked quickly to stabilize Marcus's arm and inject him with powerful painkillers that finally stopped his screaming and reduced him to quiet whimpering. As they prepared to transport him to the base hospital, one of the medics looked up at Sarah with a mixture of professional curiosity and personal awe. "Ma'am, I've been treating training injuries for 12 years, he said quietly. "I've never seen damage quite like this from a hand-to-hand combat exercise. What exactly happened here?" Sarah looked down at Marcus, who was now semi-conscious from the pain medication, but still conscious enough to stare at her with a mixture of hatred and fear. "Sergeant Thompson volunteered to participate in a demonstration of defensive techniques," she said simply. "He chose to make it realistic. I responded appropriately." The medic nodded slowly, clearly understanding that there was more to the story than Sarah was sharing, but also understanding that it wasn't his place to ask further questions. He and his team loaded Marcus onto the stretcher and wheeled him out of the facility, leaving behind a crowd of stunned soldiers and visiting military leaders who were all trying to process what they had just witnessed. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the ranking officer overseeing the demonstration, approached Sarah with careful steps. Colonel Hayes was a 30-year veteran who had seen combat in 3 different conflicts and thought she had witnessed every possible scenario that military training could produce. But this was something entirely new. "Lieutenant Mitchell," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "I think we need to discuss what just happened here." Sarah nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Should I continue with the demonstration, or the demonstration is over?" Colonel Hayes interrupted. "Please dismiss the soldiers and meet me in conference room A in 15 minutes. We need to talk." As the soldiers filed out of the training facility, many of them turned back to stare at Sarah with expressions that ranged from admiration to fear to complete bewilderment. They had come to observe a routine training demonstration and had instead witnessed something that would be talked about in military circles for years to come. The visiting military leaders were equally stunned. General Heinrich Müller from the German army approached Colonel Hayes before leaving the facility. "Colonel Hayes," he said in heavily accented English, "in 43 years of military service, I have never seen anything quite like what that young woman just did. Is this typical of your new training protocols?" Colonel Hayes struggled for an appropriate response. "The situation was unique, General." Lieutenant Mitchell's response was both technically proficient and situationally appropriate. "But no, this is not typical of our standard training demonstrations." General Müller nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps it should be. If your soldiers can maintain that level of composure and effectiveness under pressure, your training programs are more advanced than we realized." Similar conversations were taking place among the other visiting military leaders. Word of what had happened would spread quickly through international military communities, enhancing the reputation of American military training in ways that no planned demonstration could have achieved. But the immediate concern was dealing with the aftermath of Marcus Thompson's assault and Sarah Mitchell's response. Conference room A was a small, sterile space typically used for officer briefings and disciplinary hearings. When Sarah arrived, she found not only Colonel Hayes, but also Major General Robert Morrison, the base commander, and Captain Elena Rodriguez, who had been hastily summoned as Sarah's original recruiting officer. "Sit down, Lieutenant," Colonel Hayes said, gesturing to a chair across from the three senior officers. Sarah sat at attention, her back straight, and her hands folded in her lap. She had expected this conversation and had already prepared herself for whatever consequences might follow from her actions. Major General Morrison opened a file folder and spread several documents across the table. "Lieutenant Mitchell, we need to establish exactly what happened in that training facility. According to preliminary reports, Sergeant Thompson suffered a compound fracture of his right ulna, complete dislocation of his elbow joint, and significant soft tissue damage. He's currently in surgery, and doctors estimate it will take at least 6 months for him to regain limited use of his arm, assuming the surgery is successful." Sarah nodded. "Yes, sir. I observed his injuries before the medical team arrived. What we need to understand," Major General Morrison continued, "is how a routine training demonstration resulted in such severe injuries. Multiple witnesses report that Sergeant Thompson threw a punch at you, and your defensive response caused his injuries. Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir. Sergeant Thompson attacked me without provocation during the demonstration. I responded using appropriate defensive techniques to neutralize the threat and protect myself." Colonel Hayes leaned forward. "Lieutenant, I need you to understand the gravity of this situation. Sergeant Thompson is claiming that you used excessive force, that his attack was not serious enough to warrant the level of response you provided. He's also claiming that he was intoxicated and not fully responsible for his actions." Sarah felt a flash of anger, but kept her voice level. "Ma'am, with respect, Sergeant Thompson's level of intoxication is not relevant to my right to defend myself when he chose to assault me in front of hundreds of witnesses. His impairment, if anything, made him more dangerous, not less." Captain Rodriguez spoke up for the first time. "Sarah, we're not questioning your right to defend yourself. What we need to understand is whether your response was proportionate to the threat you faced. You're 5'4" and weigh maybe 130 pounds. He's 6'2" and weighs over 200 pounds. The optics are that a smaller person successfully defended herself against a larger attacker. Sarah interrupted, then immediately caught herself. I apologize for interrupting, Captain, but I need to point out that my size relative to Sergeant Thompson's is exactly why I needed to respond decisively. If I had attempted to simply block or evade his attack, he would have continued attacking until he succeeded in hurting me. The technique I used was designed to stop his attack immediately and prevent further violence. Major General Morrison studied Sarah for a long moment. Lieutenant, in your professional opinion, was Sergeant Thompson's attack serious enough to justify potentially ending his military career? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah understood that her answer would determine not only her own future, but also how similar situations would be handled throughout the military in years to come. Sir, she said carefully, Sergeant Thompson made the decision to assault a superior officer in front of hundreds of witnesses, including visiting military leaders from allied nations. He chose to do this while intoxicated, during an official military function, with no provocation other than his apparent disagreement with the training being conducted. His career was already over the moment he threw that punch. My response simply ensured that the situation ended quickly and safely for everyone else involved. The three senior officers exchanged glances. Colonel Hayes made notes on a legal pad. Captain Rodriguez nodded slowly, as if Sarah had confirmed something she had already suspected. There's another aspect to this situation, Major General Morrison said. The visiting military leaders are calling this one of the most impressive displays of military training effectiveness they've ever witnessed. General Mueller specifically requested information about incorporating your techniques into German Army training protocols. The French and British representatives have made similar inquiries. Sarah blinked in surprise. She had been so focused on the potential negative consequences of her actions that she hadn't considered the possibility that the international military community might view the incident positively. What I'm saying, Lieutenant, is that while we have to investigate this incident thoroughly and ensure that appropriate procedures were followed, the practical result is that you've enhanced the reputation of American military training in ways we never could have planned. The visiting leaders saw exactly what our new programs are designed to achieve. Soldiers who can maintain perfect composure and effectiveness even under unexpected and high-stress conditions. Colonel Hayes closed her notebook and looked directly at Sarah. However, this incident has also raised questions that we need to address. Your background is in martial arts and self-defense training, not military combat. Some people are going to argue that your response was based on civilian self-defense mentality rather than military rules of engagement. The distinction was important. Military rules of engagement typically emphasized using the minimum force necessary to control a situation, while civilian self-defense often focused on stopping an attack as quickly and decisively as possible. Sarah's response had definitely been from the civilian playbook. Ma'am, I understand the concern, Sarah replied. But Sergeant Thompson's attack was not a military engagement. It was a criminal assault by an intoxicated soldier who had lost control of his emotions. In that context, I believe civilian self-defense principles were more appropriate than military rules of engagement. Captain Rodriguez smiled slightly. That's exactly the kind of thinking that made me recruit you in the first place. The ability to adapt your response to the specific situation rather than following a rigid protocol. The meeting continued for another hour, covering every detail of the incident and its aftermath. Sarah answered every question honestly and directly, never attempting to minimize her actions or shift responsibility to Marcus Thompson. By the time the meeting ended, it was clear that while there would be a formal investigation, Sarah was not going to face serious consequences for defending herself. But the real consequences were just beginning to unfold. The investigation that followed the training demonstration incident was unlike anything Fort Braxton had ever conducted. What should have been a routine review of a training accident became a complex examination of military protocol, gender dynamics, proportional response, and the fine line between self-defense and excessive force. Sarah Mitchell found herself at the center of a storm she had never anticipated. Within 24 hours of the incident, her name and actions were being discussed in Pentagon briefings, military law offices, and barracks across the country. The story had taken on a life of its own, growing and changing with each telling until it barely resembled what had actually happened in that training facility. The official investigation was led by Colonel James Henderson, a by-the-book military lawyer with 25 years of experience in military justice. He arrived at Fort Braxton 3 days after the incident with a team of investigators and a mandate to determine whether criminal charges should be filed against either Sarah or Marcus Thompson. Colonel Henderson's first interview with Sarah lasted 4 hours and covered every aspect of her background, training, and the specific details of the incident. He was particularly interested in her martial arts training and whether she had been taught to use potentially lethal techniques. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said, reviewing notes from his legal pad, "your instructor, Jack Miller, is a former Marine with extensive combat experience. Did he ever discuss with you the legal implications of using martial arts techniques against civilians or fellow service members?" Sarah had prepared for this question. "Yes, sir." Mr. Miller was very clear that the techniques he taught were for self-defense only, and that we had a responsibility to use only the minimum force necessary to stop an attack. He also emphasized that once an attacker was no longer a threat, any further action would be legally and morally wrong. "And in your assessment, was Sergeant Thompson still a threat after you broke his arm?" "No, sir. Once his arm was broken and he was on the ground in pain, he was no longer capable of continuing his attack. That's why I immediately called for medical assistance, rather than applying any additional force." Colonel Henderson nodded and made more notes. "Multiple witnesses report that you remained completely calm throughout the entire incident. You showed no signs of fear, anger, or emotional distress. Some of the soldiers found this unusual. Can you explain your emotional state during and after the incident?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. "Sir, my training taught me that emotional responses interfere with effective decision-making in crisis situations. When Sergeant Thompson attacked me, I focused on neutralizing the threat as quickly and safely as possible. Allowing myself to become emotional would have made me less effective and potentially more dangerous to everyone involved." The interview continued with increasingly detailed questions about Sarah's intentions, her awareness of the potential consequences of her actions, and her assessment of whether alternative responses might have been more appropriate. Throughout it all, Sarah maintained her composure and answered every question honestly and directly. But while Sarah was defending her actions in formal interviews, Marcus Thompson was telling a very different story from his hospital bed. His version of events painted Sarah as an aggressive instructor who had been looking for an opportunity to humiliate a student who had used excessive force against a clearly intoxicated soldier who posed no real threat. "She could have just stepped away," Marcus told Colonel Henderson during his own interview. "She could have called for security. Instead, she chose to break my arm in front of hundreds of people. That wasn't self-defense. That was revenge for me challenging her authority." Marcus's injuries supported his claims about the severity of Sarah's response. The surgery to repair his arm had required the insertion of metal plates and screws to hold the shattered bone together. His doctors estimated that even with extensive physical therapy, he would never regain full strength or range of motion in his right arm. His military career was effectively over. The physical evidence from the incident was minimal but telling. Security cameras had captured the entire confrontation from multiple angles, clearly showing Marcus throwing the first punch and Sarah's defensive response. But the cameras couldn't capture context, emotion, or intent. They showed actions without revealing the thoughts and feelings that had driven those actions. The 314 soldiers who had witnessed the incident were interviewed individually by the investigation team. Their accounts were remarkably consistent about the basic facts. Marcus had attacked Sarah without obvious provocation, and Sarah had defended herself using techniques that had resulted in severe injuries. But their interpretations of those facts varied dramatically. Private Jennifer Walsh, a 20-year-old recruit from Ohio, told investigators that she had been impressed by Sarah's composure and effectiveness. She didn't lose control or get emotional like I probably would have. She just handled the situation professionally and called for help immediately. I thought it showed exactly the kind of calm leadership we're supposed to learn from our officers. Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, a veteran with 2 combat deployments, had a different perspective. Look, Thompson was out of line, and he got what he deserved. But Lieutenant Mitchell's response was maybe a little too controlled, Like she had been planning for something like this to happen. It made me wonder if she's the kind of person who looks for opportunities to hurt people. The varying reactions reflected deeper tensions within the military about gender roles, authority, and appropriate use of force. Some soldiers saw Sarah's actions as proof that women could be just as effective as men in combat situations. Others viewed her response as unnecessarily aggressive and potentially dangerous to unit cohesion. The investigation team also discovered troubling information about Marcus Thompson's behavior in the months leading up to the incident. His commanding officers reported increasing problems with alcohol, insubordination, and anger management. Several soldiers came forward to report incidents where Marcus had intimidated or threatened fellow service members, though none had filed formal complaints. Staff Sergeant Michelle Chun provided perhaps the most damaging testimony about Marcus's character. She reported an incident 3 weeks before the training demonstration where Marcus had cornered her in the motor pool and made sexually suggestive comments while standing close enough that she could smell alcohol on his breath. I didn't report it because I didn't think anyone would believe me over him, she told investigators. He never actually touched me, and I knew he was going through a divorce, but he scared me. The way he looked at me, I started making sure I was never alone anywhere he might be. This pattern of behavior suggested that Marcus's attack on Sarah wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of using his size and strength to intimidate others. It also raised questions about how many other incidents had gone unreported because soldiers felt they wouldn't be believed or supported by their superiors. 5 days into the investigation, Colonel Henderson received an unexpected visitor. Jack Miller had driven down from Iowa to Fort Braxton, carrying a folder full of documentation about Sarah's training and character references from law enforcement officials who had attended her self-defense seminars. "Colonel," Jack said, settling his large frame into the small chair across from Henderson's desk, "I trained Sarah Mitchell for 6 years, and I need you to understand something about her character. She's not a violent person. She's not someone who looks for fights or enjoys hurting people. Everything I taught her was about avoiding violence when possible and ending it quickly when avoidance wasn't an option." Colonel Henderson reviewed the materials Jack had brought. Letters from police officers, prosecutors, and victims' advocates all praised Sarah's approach to self-defense training. Several specifically mentioned her emphasis on de-escalation techniques and her insistence that physical force should only be used as a last resort. "What I'm trying to tell you," Jack continued, "is that if Sarah Mitchell broke that soldier's arm, it's because she genuinely believed it was necessary to protect herself. She's not the kind of person who would use excessive force just to make a point." But Jack's testimony, while compelling, couldn't change the central facts of the case. Sarah's response to Marcus's attack had resulted in severe and permanent injuries that far exceeded what many people considered appropriate for the level of threat she had faced. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Colonel Henderson's team discovered that the incident had been recorded not only by security cameras, but also by several soldiers using their personal smartphones. These recordings have been shared on social media platforms, where they had gone viral and attracted international attention. The hashtag Lieutenant Mitchell began trending on various platforms, with thousands of people sharing their opinions about Sarah's actions. Feminist groups hailed her as a symbol of women's strength and self-determination. Men's rights activists accused her of using excessive force against a man who was clearly struggling with personal problems. Military supporters praised her composure and effectiveness under pressure. The viral videos also attracted the attention of news organizations. Within a week of the incident, Sarah found herself featured in stories on CNN, Fox News, and military publication websites around the world. Most of the coverage was positive, focusing on her background as a martial arts instructor and her innovative approach to military training. But the media attention also brought unwanted scrutiny to both Sarah and Marcus. Reporters tracked down Sarah's mother in Iowa, Marcus's ex-wife in Detroit, and various people from their respective backgrounds. Details about their personal lives began appearing in news stories, often with little regard for accuracy or privacy. Jessica Thompson, Marcus's ex-wife, gave an interview to a Detroit television station that proved particularly damaging to Marcus's claims about Sarah's excessive response. She described years of living with Marcus's anger and violence, including incidents where he had broken furniture, punched walls, and threatened to hurt her if she tried to leave him. "I've been waiting for something like this to happen for years," she told the reporter. Marcus never learned to control his temper, and he never accepted that his size doesn't give him the right to intimidate people. What happened to him was exactly what should happen to bullies who think they can hurt people without consequences. The interview was broadcast nationwide and effectively undermined Marcus's portrayal of himself as a victim of Sarah's excessive response. Public opinion, which had been somewhat divided, began shifting strongly in Sarah's favor. Meanwhile, Sarah was struggling with the unexpected attention and the demands of the ongoing investigation. She continued her regular duties at Fort Braxton, but the incident had changed how people interacted with her. Some soldiers treated her with newfound respect, while others seemed uncomfortable around her, as if they were afraid she might suddenly attack them without warning. The most difficult part was the isolation. Sarah had always been somewhat solitary by nature, preferring small groups of close friends to large social gatherings. But now she found herself truly alone, set apart from her colleagues by an incident that had revealed capabilities that made people uncomfortable. Captain Rodriguez visited her regularly during the investigation, providing both professional support and personal friendship during a time when Sarah needed both. "How are you holding up?" Rodriguez asked during one of their meetings. "I'm fine," Sarah replied automatically, then reconsidered. "Actually, that's not true. I'm struggling with how this has changed everything. I did what I thought was right, but now I'm not sure if I made the best choice. What would you do differently if you could do it again?" Sarah thought about the question for several minutes before answering. "I would probably try to de-escalate the situation verbally before Thompson reached the point where he felt he needed to attack me. Maybe if I had recognized how unstable he was earlier, I could have defused his anger before it became dangerous. And if verbal de-escalation hadn't worked, if he had still chosen to attack you, then I would do exactly what I did. I'm not going to apologize for refusing to let someone hurt me just because they're bigger and stronger than I am." The investigation concluded after 2 weeks of interviews, evidence review, and legal analysis. Colonel Henderson's final report was comprehensive and nuanced, acknowledging the complexity of the situation while drawing clear conclusions about the actions of both Sarah and Marcus. The report found that Marcus Thompson had committed assault against a superior officer while under the influence of alcohol during an official military function. It recommended that he be court-martialed and dishonorably discharged from the Army. Given his injuries and the end of his military career, the report noted additional punishment would serve no useful purpose. Regarding Sarah's actions, the report concluded that her response was legally justified under both military and civilian self-defense standards. The report specifically noted that Sarah had used appropriate techniques to stop an attack without causing unnecessary additional harm, and that she had immediately called for medical assistance once the threat was neutralized. But the report also included recommendations that would change how similar situations would be handled in the future, and those recommendations would have profound implications for Sarah's career and the future of military training programs. 6 months after the incident that would define her military career, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood before a panel of generals at the Pentagon, waiting to learn whether her actions that day had opened doors or closed them forever. The hearing room was smaller than she had expected, but The weight of the moment filled every corner of the space. The investigation had concluded with her complete vindication, but vindication and acceptance were two very different things. Colonel Henderson's report had not only cleared her of any wrongdoing, but had also recommended that her training techniques be incorporated into standard military protocols. The Army, it seemed, wanted to learn from what had happened that day at Fort Braxton. General Patricia Coleman, the first woman to serve as Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, led the panel reviewing Sarah's future assignments. She had read every page of the investigation report, watched the security footage multiple times, and interviewed dozens of people who had worked with Sarah throughout her military career. Lieutenant Mitchell, General Coleman began, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in uniform. Your actions during the training incident have generated significant discussion at the highest levels of military leadership. We need to determine how best to utilize your skills and experience going forward. Sarah stood at attention, her dress uniform crisp and her bearing professional despite the uncertainty churning in her stomach. The past 6 months have been a whirlwind of interviews, media attention, and speculation about her future. She had continued her duties at Fort Braxton, but everyone knew this hearing would determine whether she had a long-term future in the Army. The investigation found your actions to be justified and appropriate, General Coleman continued. But it also revealed some unique aspects of her background and training that raise important questions about how we prepare our soldiers for close-quarters combat situations. The general opened a thick folder and spread several documents across the table. We've received requests from 7 different countries asking for information about your training methods. The German Army specifically wants to send instructors to learn your techniques. The British Special Forces have inquired about joint training programs. The French Military Academy wants to invite you as a visiting instructor. Sarah blinked in surprise. She had known about the international interest, but the scope of it was larger than she had realized. What this tells us, General Coleman said, is that you've demonstrated capabilities that the international military community recognizes as significant advances in personal combat training. The question is how we can best utilize those capabilities while addressing some of the concerns that have been raised. General William Barrett, a gruff veteran with combat experience spanning 3 conflicts, leaned forward. Lieutenant, some people are concerned that your background is more civilian than military. Your techniques are effective, but they're designed to end fights quickly rather than control situations according to military protocols. How do we reconcile that difference? Sarah had prepared for this question during months of reflection about her actions and their implications. Sir, I believe the key is teaching soldiers to recognize when civilian self-defense principles are more appropriate than military rules of engagement. The situation with Sergeant Thompson wasn't a military combat scenario. It was a criminal assault that happened to occur on a military base. In that context, stopping the attack quickly and decisively was more important than attempting to control or de-escalate the situation. General Barrett nodded thoughtfully. But how do we train soldiers to make that distinction in real time? How do we ensure they choose the appropriate response for each situation? The same way we train them to make any other tactical decisions, sir. Through repetition, scenario-based training, and constant evaluation of decision-making under stress. The techniques themselves are just tools. The real training is in knowing when and how to use them. General Coleman made notes on a legal pad. The investigation also revealed some interesting statistics about soldiers who have attended your training programs. They show significantly lower rates of disciplinary problems, fewer incidents of interpersonal violence, and higher performance ratings on physical fitness tests. Can you explain those correlations? Sarah had noticed these patterns herself, but hadn't fully understood their implications until recently. Ma'am, I think the training gives soldiers confidence in their ability to handle physical confrontations, which reduces their need to prove themselves through aggressive behavior. When you know you can defend yourself effectively, you don't feel the need to start fights to establish dominance. And the improved performance ratings? The mental discipline required for martial arts training carries over into other areas of military service. Students learn to push through physical discomfort, to remain calm under pressure, and to focus on objectives rather than emotions. Those skills are valuable far beyond combat situations. The hearing continued for 2 hours, covering every aspect of Sarah's background, training methods, and future potential. The generals asked detailed questions about her teaching philosophy, her thoughts on adapting civilian martial arts for military use, and her willingness to take on expanded responsibilities. Finally, General Coleman closed her folder and looked directly at Sarah. Lieutenant Mitchell, we're prepared to offer you several options for your continued service. The first is a promotion to captain and assignment to the Army's new Close Quarters Combat Training Division, where you would develop curriculum and train instructors for implementation across all branches of the military. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. This was beyond anything she had dared to hope for. The second option, General Coleman continued, is acceptance into the Army's Advanced Officer Education Program, where you would earn a master's degree in military science while continuing to develop your training expertise. Upon completion, you would likely be assigned to the Pentagon to help shape military training policy at the national level. Both options represented significant advancement and recognition of her abilities. But General Coleman wasn't finished. The third option is the most challenging and potentially the most impactful. We're prepared to recommend you for assignment to the Special Operations Command, where you would work with elite units to develop specialized training programs for high-risk situations. This assignment would require additional security clearances and would involve working with classified programs. Sarah struggled to process the magnitude of what she was being offered. 6 months ago, she had been a junior officer running routine training programs at a mid-level military base. Now she was being offered opportunities that could shape military training for years to come. All three options come with immediate promotion to captain, General Barrett added. Your actions at Fort Braxton demonstrated leadership potential that we want to develop and utilize. Sarah took a deep breath before responding. Generals, I'm honored by all of these opportunities. May I ask what happened to Sergeant Thompson? General Coleman's expression became more serious. Sergeant Thompson was court-martialed and received a dishonorable discharge. His assault on you ended his military career and resulted in the loss of all veteran benefits. His arm healed, but he has limited range of motion and chronic pain. He's currently working as a security guard in Detroit and has entered an alcohol treatment program. Sarah nodded silently. She had often wondered about Marcus's fate, though she had tried not to let it influence her feelings about her own future. I need to ask you directly, Lieutenant, General Coleman said. Do you have any regrets about how you handled the situation with Sergeant Thompson? Sarah considered the question carefully. It was one she had asked herself countless times during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come, when she replayed those few seconds over and over in her mind. I regret that the situation occurred at all, she said finally. I regret that Sergeant Thompson's personal problems led him to make choices that destroyed his career and caused him permanent injury. I regret that what should have been a routine training demonstration became a spectacle that overshadowed the real work we were trying to accomplish. She paused, then continued. But I don't regret defending myself. I don't regret using the skills I had trained years to develop when someone chose to attack me. And I don't regret refusing to be a victim just because it might have been easier or more socially acceptable than fighting back. General Barrett smiled slightly. That's exactly the answer we hope to hear. A leader who can take responsibility for outcomes while standing firm on principles is exactly what we need in advanced positions. The hearing concluded with Sarah accepting the first option, promotion to captain and assignment to lead the new Close Quarters Combat Training Division. It was a position that would allow her to directly influence how thousands of soldiers were trained while giving her the opportunity to refine and improve the techniques that had already proven so effective. But the personal cost of her success became clear during her final week at Fort Braxton. As she cleaned out her office and said goodbye to colleagues, Sarah realized how isolated she had become. The incident with Marcus had set her apart from her peers in ways that promotion and recognition couldn't bridge. Some soldiers treated her with genuine respect and admiration. Others seemed uncomfortable around her, as if they were afraid she might suddenly attack them if they said something wrong. A few were openly hostile, viewing her success as undeserved advancement based on a single dramatic incident rather than sustained excellence. The most difficult conversation was with Captain Rodriguez, who had been both mentor and friend throughout Sarah's military career. "Are you proud of what you've accomplished?" Rodriguez asked as they shared coffee in the base cafeteria for what might be the last time. Sarah thought about the question for several minutes. "I'm proud that I've been able to turn something difficult into something positive. I'm proud that the techniques I learned from Jack Miller might help other soldiers defend themselves someday. I'm proud that I didn't let fear or self-doubt stop me from standing up for myself. But I wish the cost hadn't been so high for everyone involved." Marcus Thompson lost everything because of choices he made, but he's still a human being with a daughter who loves him. The soldiers who witnessed what happened will carry that image for the rest of their lives. Even the positive outcomes came at a price that sometimes feels too heavy. Rodriguez nodded understandingly. "That's what makes you the right person for this assignment. You understand that strength isn't just about the ability to hurt people. It's about the wisdom to know when and how to use that ability responsibly." Sarah's new assignment took her to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where the Army's Command and Staff College was located. Her office was in a building that had trained military leaders for over a century, and she felt the weight of that history every time she walked through its hallways. The Close Quarters Combat Training Division was a new concept born directly from the lessons learned during the investigation of her actions at Fort Braxton. Sarah's job was to develop training programs that would teach soldiers not just physical techniques, but the mental discipline and decision-making skills necessary to use those techniques appropriately. Her first major project was creating a training curriculum that could be adapted for different branches of the military and different levels of experience. She drew heavily on her background with Jack Miller, but also incorporated lessons she had learned from her own military service and the feedback she had received from the international military community. The program she developed emphasized 3 core principles: situation assessment, proportional response, and immediate medical assistance. Students learned to quickly evaluate threats, choose appropriate defensive techniques, and provide care for injured opponents once conflicts ended. But perhaps the most important aspect of the program was its focus on the psychological aftermath of physical confrontations. Sarah had experienced firsthand how using violence, even in self-defense, could change a person's relationship with themselves and others. Her program included extensive training on managing the emotional and psychological consequences of combat situations. 2 years after the incident at Fort Braxton, Captain Sarah Mitchell stood before her first class of instructor candidates, 24 experienced soldiers who would take her training methods back to their home units. As she looked at their faces, she saw echoes of her younger self. People who had chosen to dedicate their lives to service, but who understood that sometimes service required difficult choices and personal sacrifice. "The techniques you'll learn here aren't about becoming a warrior," she told them during her opening remarks. "They're about becoming a protector. They're about having the skills and confidence to defend yourself and others while maintaining the discipline to use those skills wisely and compassionately." One of the students, a young sergeant from Texas, raised her hand. "Ma'am, how do we know when we're using appropriate force? How do we make those split-second decisions without second-guessing ourselves afterward?" Sarah smiled, remembering when she had asked Jack Miller almost the same question years earlier in a small studio in Cedar Falls, Iowa. "You train until the right decisions become instinctive," she replied. "You practice scenarios until you can trust your judgment even under extreme stress. And you remember that every person you might face in conflict is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend. The goal is never to hurt people. The goal is to stop them from hurting you or others." As the training program continued, Sarah began to see the impact her work was having beyond just physical techniques. The soldiers who completed her programs returned to their units with increased confidence, better judgment, and a more mature understanding of when and how to use force. Disciplinary incidents decreased, performance ratings improved, and unit cohesion strengthened. The international military community continued to show interest in her methods. Sarah found herself traveling to allied nations, conducting training programs, and sharing techniques that had been born from a moment of violence but had grown into a comprehensive approach to personal defense and conflict resolution. 5 years after breaking Marcus Thompson's arm in front of 314 soldiers, Major Sarah Mitchell, she had been promoted again, received a letter that she had never expected. It was from Marcus himself, written in careful handwriting that suggested his injured arm still caused him difficulties. Major Mitchell, the letter began, "I know this letter may surprise you, and I understand if you choose not to read it. But I wanted you to know that I've been following your career and the work you're doing with military training programs. I've been in therapy for 3 years now, working on the anger and alcohol problems that led to my attack on you that day. I've learned a lot about myself and about the choices I made, and I want you to know that I take full responsibility for what happened. What you did that day probably saved other people from being hurt by me later. I was out of control, and if you hadn't stopped me when you did, I might have hurt someone else, maybe someone who couldn't defend themselves the way you could. I know I destroyed my own career and caused you a lot of trouble. I know my daughter grew up thinking her father was someone to be afraid of instead of someone to look up to. I can't change any of that, but I wanted you to know that I understand now why what you did was necessary. I hope the work you're doing helps other soldiers avoid making the mistakes I made. I hope it helps them understand that real strength isn't about hurting people. It's about protecting them. Respectfully, Marcus Thompson." Sarah read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in her desk drawer. She would keep it there as a reminder that even the most difficult moments could lead to growth, understanding, and redemption. 10 years later, Brigadier General Sarah Mitchell stood in a training facility similar to the one where her career had been defined by a single moment of violence and response. But this facility was different. It was a new National Combat Training Center designed according to principles she had developed and refined over a decade of military service. The soldiers training here learned not just how to fight, but when to fight, how much force to use, and how to live with the consequences of their actions. They learned that true strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to protect them while protecting themselves. As she watched a young instructor demonstrate defensive techniques to a group of attentive students, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. It had begun with a frightened teenage girl in an Iowa park and had led through years of training, a moment of terrible clarity in front of hundreds of witnesses, and ultimately to a career dedicated to helping others find their own strength. The price of that strength had been higher than she had ever imagined when she first walked into Jack Miller's studio all those years ago. But looking at the soldiers whose lives might be saved by the training they were receiving, Sarah knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. Sometimes she understood now, the greatest act of courage isn't throwing a punch. It's being strong enough to break someone's arm to save their soul, wise enough to turn a moment of violence into a lifetime of protection for others, and compassionate enough to forgive both your attacker and yourself for the choices that moments of crisis force upon us all.